slow, quiet, slightly uncomfortable. And before we begin, just a small reminder. If you enjoy this kind of sleepy, quietly miserable history, remember to press subscribe. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle click. Now, let's begin. Most stories about the American frontier like to use words such as freedom, opportunity, and new beginnings. In reality, survival on the frontier was less about bold dreams and more about enduring long stretches of hunger, cold, confusion, and regret. People did not head west because they were strong. They went because staying where they were felt worse. Unfortunately, the frontier did not care about their reasons. For many families, survival began with a wagon that was already overloaded and underprepared. These wagons creaked slowly across thousands of miles of uneven land, pulled by animals that were tired long before the people were. Inside were supplies meant to last months, sometimes years, carefully planned but almost always insufficient. Flour went moldy, salt ran out, ammunition was miscounted. By the time mistakes were noticed, it was already too late to turn back. Cold was one of the frontier's most reliable killers. Winter did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, night by night, until frostbite became normal, and numb fingers were something people learned to ignore. Many cabins were poorly sealed, with gaps that allowed wind to pass freely through walls. Firewood ran out faster than expected. People slept in layers of clothing, breathing shallowly, hoping morning would arrive before the fire died completely. Hunger was slower, but no less effective. Hunting was unpredictable, and farming took time the frontier rarely allowed. Crops failed for reasons settlers did not understand. Soil looked fertile, but wasn't. Rain came too early, or not at all. Meals became smaller, then simpler, then non-existent. People boiled leather, chewed on bark, and pretended it was temporary. It usually wasn't. Illness followed closely behind. A minor infection, easily treatable today, often became fatal. Cuts from tools turned black and swollen. Fevers came without warning and stayed without explanation. Doctors were rare, medicine was limited, and knowledge was incomplete. People relied on home remedies, prayer, or simple waiting. Waiting often failed. Isolation may have been the most quietly damaging part of frontier survival. Neighbors could be miles away. Entire weeks passed without seeing another person. When something went wrong, there was no help coming quickly, if at all. People learned to bury their own dead. Sometimes they learned to do it more than once in the same winter. Some survival stories became famous later, told as tales of heroism, but lived in real time. They were not inspiring. They were exhausting. Survivors did not feel victorious. They felt older, thinner, permanently changed. Survival meant waking up the next morning and doing the same unpleasant things again, without knowing when they would stop. Many did not survive. Wagons were abandoned along trails, left where people finally gave up. Graves were shallow and unmarked. Names were forgotten. The frontier did not record losses carefully. It simply absorbed them. Those who lived long enough to settle often discovered that survival did not end once the journey was over. Life on the frontier continued to demand constant effort. Repairs never stopped. Food remained uncertain. Safety was temporary. Even success felt fragile, always one bad season away from collapse. In the end, the most brutal survival stories of the American frontier are not about dramatic last stands or sudden disasters. They are about endurance, about waking up cold, about eating less than you should, about continuing, quietly, because stopping felt worse. And in the next part, we will look at one of these stories more closely. A group of people who survived not through bravery or skill, but through stubborn persistence and a series of deeply uncomfortable decisions. For now, you can rest. The frontier will still be unpleasant when we return. One of the most often mentioned frontier survival stories involves a group of settlers who did everything they were told to do and still ended up trapped by geography, weather, and timing. They left at what seemed like a reasonable season. Their supplies were measured carefully. Their intentions were sensible. None of this mattered once the mountains decided otherwise. The journey slowed gradually at first. Wheels cracked, axles complained, animals weakened. Every mile took longer than the last, and the days began to shorten in a way that made people nervous without fully understanding why. Snow appeared earlier than expected, thin at first, then constant. Progress became a negotiation with the ground itself. Food was rationed carefully, at least in the beginning. People agreed on portions. They promised fairness. Eventually, fairness became theoretical. Children were given more. Adults pretended they weren't hungry. Everyone lied a little, mostly to themselves. Hunger has a way of narrowing conversations. Fewer words were wasted. Complaints stopped being useful. Shelter was improvised and temporary. Tents sagged under snow. Makeshift cabins trapped smoke more effectively than heat. Nights stretched longer than days. Sleep came in short, uncomfortable pieces, interrupted by coughing, crying, or the sound of wind pressing patiently against thin walls. When animals began to die, morale followed shortly after. Horses and oxen were not just transportation, they were plans, they were future movement. Once they were gone, the group stopped thinking in terms of destinations and started thinking only about survival until morning. Meat from these animals was eaten carefully, slowly, and with an awareness that once it was gone, nothing would replace it. Illness moved through the group quietly. It rarely announced itself. Someone would lie down and simply not stand up again. Fevers burned. Strength disappeared. Care was basic and limited. There was no isolation, no proper treatment, and very little understanding of what was happening inside the body. People learned to recognize the sound of breathing that meant someone would not last the night. Decision-making became more difficult as energy faded. People argued, then apologized, then stopped arguing altogether. Choices were made too late or not at all. Should they move? Should they stay? Should they split up? Every option carried risk, and doing nothing was also dangerous. In the end, many frontier survivors did not choose correctly. They chose what they could manage. Some survival required actions that were never meant to be discussed later. At the time, they were not framed as moral dilemmas. They were framed as necessities. Hunger stripped away philosophy quickly. Survival stories often soften this part, focusing on resilience rather than the uncomfortable details of what people were willing to do in order to continue breathing for another day. What kept some people alive was not strength or intelligence, but routine. Waking up, checking fires, counting remaining food, doing small tasks even when they felt pointless. Routine created a sense of normality where none existed. It gave structure to days that otherwise blended together into one long, frozen waiting period. Eventually, rescue came for a few. It was late, incomplete, and far from dramatic. People were found thin, quiet, and strangely calm. Some did not react much at all. Survival had drained them of excess emotion. Those who were saved rarely spoke much during the journey back. Talking required energy they no longer had. The frontier did not reward these survivors with clarity or closure. Many lived long afterward, but not comfortably. Bodies recovered slowly. Minds carried memories that were difficult to explain to people who had not been there. Frontier survival left marks that could not be seen easily, but never fully faded. These stories became part of American mythology later, cleaned up and simplified, but lived honestly. They were not about triumph. They were about persistence, about continuing when stopping felt inevitable, about enduring conditions that made no promises of improvement. In the next part, we will look at another kind of frontier survival, not one shaped by snow and isolation, but by heat, exhaustion, and the quiet danger of believing the land would be kinder than it was. For now, you can rest. Survival does not improve quickly. It just continues. Not all frontier survival stories took place in frozen landscapes. Many unfolded under a sun that offered no relief, only exposure. Heat did not arrive suddenly. It settled in slowly, day after day, until exhaustion became the normal state of being awake. The land looked open and promising from a distance. Up close, it offered very little. Travel across hot, dry territory required a different kind of endurance. Water became the primary concern almost immediately. Maps were unreliable. Rivers appeared where they were not supposed to be, and disappeared where they were expected. Wells were shallow, bitter, or already dry. People learned to measure progress not in miles, but in hours until the next drink. Animals suffered first. Horses slowed, then stumbled. Oxen refused to move. Once they collapsed, they rarely stood again. Their deaths were practical disasters. Without them, wagons were useless. Supplies were abandoned along the trail, chosen not for value, but for weight. Furniture, tools, and family possessions were left behind in the dust, marked briefly by regret and then forgotten. Heat changed how people thought. Decisions became impulsive, tempers shortened, arguments broke out over small things, then burned out just as quickly. Energy was too limited for prolonged anger. People learned to conserve movement, speech, and even eye contact. Everything unnecessary was quietly dropped. Illness in hot environments worked differently, but just as effectively. Dehydration weakened bodies until simple tasks became dangerous. Sun exposure, blistered skin, and blurred vision. Infections thrived. A small cut could become serious within days. There were no clean bandages, no proper sanitation, and little understanding of how heat accelerated decline. Some groups pushed forward when they should have stopped. Others stopped when moving would have saved them. The frontier did not offer clear feedback. People often realized mistakes only after it was impossible to correct them. Survival depended heavily on timing, and timing was rarely on their side. Night brought little comfort. Heat lingered in the ground, radiating upward. Sleep was shallow and interrupted. Insects filled the darkness. Food spoiled quickly. Meat dried too fast or rotted entirely. What little was edible had to be consumed immediately, whether people were hungry or not. Psychological strain built quietly. The sameness of the landscape made progress feel imaginary. Hills never seemed closer. Horizons did not change. People began to doubt their direction, their judgment, and eventually, their memories. Some became convinced they were walking in circles. Others believed rescue was closer than it actually was. Hope, like water, was carefully rationed. A few survived through restraint rather than effort. They rested during the hottest hours. They moved slowly. They ignored pressure to rush. This patience was not admirable in the moment. It was frustrating. It felt like giving up, but it kept some people alive long enough to reach help, or at least slightly better conditions. Those who did not survive were often found near water that was undrinkable. Alkaline pools, stagnant ponds, riverbeds that only looked promising from far away. The land misled easily. It did not need to be dramatic to be lethal. Survivors rarely described these journeys in detail later. Heat exhaustion erased memory unevenly. Events blurred together. Time collapsed. What remained were impressions rather than stories. Thirst, weight loss, the sound of footsteps in dry soil, the constant calculation of whether to keep going or lie down. When people finally reached settlements, they did not arrive triumphantly. They arrived quietly, thin and cautious. They asked for water first, food second, explanations much later. Frontier survival did not produce confident heroes. It produced people who preferred shade, rest, and predictability. These stories were later retold as adventures. They were framed as tests of character. In truth, they were tests of tolerance. How long could someone endure discomfort without making a fatal decision? How long could they wait without panicking? In the next part, we will consider a different kind of frontier survival altogether, one that did not depend on climate, but on misunderstanding, where danger came not from the land itself, but from assumptions people carried with them into it. For now, you can rest. The heat will still be waiting when we return. Some of the most brutal frontier survival stories did not begin with storms, snow, or thirst. They began with assumptions. People arrived believing the land would behave in familiar ways. They assumed rivers would be navigable, soil would be cooperative, and distance could be managed with effort alone. The frontier rarely corrected these ideas gently. Many settlers misunderstood scale. On maps, distances looked manageable. On the ground, they stretched endlessly. What appeared to be a short detour became days of extra travel. What looked like a nearby settlement turned out to be weeks away. This misunderstanding drained supplies faster than expected and exhausted bodies long before danger was obvious. Another common error involved food. People brought what they knew: flour, salted meat, preserved goods meant for shorter journeys. They assumed hunting would supplement their diets. Often, it did not. Game avoided heavily traveled routes. Ammunition ran low. Weapons broke. Hunting required time and energy people could not spare. Familiar foods disappeared first, and unfamiliar substitutes were slow to be trusted. Cultural misunderstanding also shaped survival in quieter, more damaging ways. Settlers frequently ignored or dismissed local knowledge. Advice from people who understood the land was treated as optional or exaggerated. Warnings were misunderstood as hostility. Guidance was mistaken for interference. This distance was not always intentional. It was often rooted in confidence that proved misplaced. Shelter decisions followed similar patterns. People built homes the way they always had. Materials were chosen for comfort rather than climate. Roofs collapsed under snow they were not designed to carry. Walls trapped heat instead of releasing it. Cabins that felt sturdy in one season became dangerous in another. Adjustments came slowly, sometimes too slowly. Time itself was misunderstood. The frontier did not move on predictable schedules. Seasons arrived early or late. Weather lingered longer than expected. Planting too soon or too late ruined entire years of effort. Missed timing meant hunger months later, when there was no obvious cause to point to anymore. Misjudging risk was another quiet failure. Some dangers were obvious and feared excessively. Others were overlooked entirely. Rivers were underestimated. Crossings went wrong quickly. Tools caused injuries that seemed minor until infection followed. Exhaustion led to mistakes. Fatigue made people careless with fire, animals, and each other. Social misunderstandings also shaped survival outcomes. Groups formed with expectations of cooperation that did not always hold. Leadership was unclear. Authority shifted under stress. Decisions were questioned too late. Arguments over responsibility drained energy that should have gone toward survival. In some cases, groups fractured entirely, each believing the other was the problem. Children were often the most affected by these misunderstandings. Adults assumed resilience would appear naturally. Instead, children weakened faster. Illness took hold quickly. Care required resources that were already scarce. Parents were forced to make decisions with no good outcomes. Survival stories rarely linger on these moments. They were too uncomfortable to retell. Some people survived because they learned to abandon assumptions early. They listened, they adjusted, they accepted that progress might be slower than planned and comfort might never arrive. These were not dramatic changes. They were small, quiet corrections repeated daily. Changing routes, changing diets, changing expectations. Others held on too long. They continued as planned because admitting error felt worse than enduring hardship. Pride delayed adaptation. Familiar routines were preserved even when they no longer worked. Survival does not reward consistency. It rewards responsiveness, even when that responsiveness feels like failure. When these survivors finally reached stability, they rarely credited insight or intelligence. They spoke instead of luck, of timing, of small decisions that happened to go the right way. Frontier survival was not predictable enough to allow for clear lessons. It punished certainty and rewarded flexibility, often without explanation. Over time, these stories were simplified. They became narratives of determination rather than caution. Misunderstanding was reframed as challenge. Adjustment became courage. The quieter truth was less inspiring but more accurate. Many people survived by slowly realizing how little they understood. In the next part, we will look at frontier survival, where misunderstanding met sudden violence. Not constant conflict, but brief moments where wrong assumptions ended lives quickly and permanently. For now, you can rest. The frontier will still misunderstand you when we return. Most frontier deaths were not dramatic battles or prolonged conflicts. They were brief moments where assumptions collided with reality, and there was no time to correct them. Violence arrived suddenly, without warning, and ended things before fear had time to fully form. Travelers often assumed danger would announce itself. They expected shouting, visible threats, or time to prepare. Instead, encounters were quiet, a misunderstanding, a movement interpreted incorrectly, a decision made in seconds that could not be reversed. Survival depended less on courage and more on timing and restraint, neither of which could be practiced reliably. Weapons were carried constantly, but this did not guarantee safety. Firearms misfired, powder became damp, ammunition ran out, knives broke. Many people who carried weapons never used them effectively. Others used them too quickly. The presence of a weapon often escalated situations that might otherwise have passed without consequence. Fatigue made violence more likely. Exhausted people misread intentions. Hunger shortened patience. Fear lowered judgment. When groups were already strained by travel, illness, or loss, small incidents carried heavier weight. A dispute over supplies, a disagreement about direction. These moments sometimes ended lives without anyone intending that outcome. Isolation amplified consequences. There were no witnesses, no mediators, and no second chances. If someone was injured seriously, help was rarely close enough to matter. Bleeding did not wait for rescue. Infection followed quickly. Violence on the frontier often killed twice, once in the moment, and again days later through complications that could not be treated. Some survival stories describe people narrowly avoiding violent outcomes through inaction rather than confrontation, not responding, stepping back, leaving areas earlier than planned. These decisions were not praised at the time. They looked like weakness. In hindsight, they appear as quiet intelligence, though they were rarely recognized as such. Other stories end abruptly. Journals stop mid-sentence. Letters were never finished. Wagons were found abandoned with no clear explanation. Violence did not always leave clear evidence. Sometimes only absence remained. A person gone, a path uncompleted, a life reduced to a question mark. The frontier did not distinguish between justified and unjustified violence. It responded only to outcomes. People who acted impulsively often did not survive long enough to regret it. Those who hesitated sometimes survived without understanding exactly why. There was no consistent rule to follow, only probabilities that shifted constantly. Children and non-combatants were not spared by circumstance. Violence did not target evenly, but it did not avoid the vulnerable either. Survival required constant awareness that safety was temporary and dependent on factors beyond individual control. This awareness shaped behavior, posture, and silence. Over time, these violent moments were simplified in retelling. They became symbols rather than events. Stories focused on bravery, resistance, or justice. The original confusion was edited out. The fear was condensed. The randomness was removed to make the narrative tolerable. For those who lived through violence, memory behaved strangely. Some remembered every detail. Others remembered almost nothing. Trauma rearranged recollection. What remained were sensations rather than stories. Sounds, smells. The sudden shift from normal to irreversible. Violence did not define frontier life, but it ended it efficiently. It interrupted routines, journeys, and expectations without explanation. It did not require long buildup. It only required proximity and misunderstanding, both of which were common. In the next part, we will move away from sudden endings and look instead at survival that required something slower and more uncomfortable. Endurance after loss. Living on after the frontier had already taken what it wanted. For now, you can rest. Sudden things pass quickly. The longer suffering waits patiently. For those who survived the frontier's sudden moments, life did not reset afterward. It thinned out. People continued with fewer resources, fewer companions, and fewer expectations. Survival became less about overcoming danger and more about accommodating absence. Someone was no longer there to help lift, decide, or remember. Daily routines adjusted quietly around missing hands. Grief on the frontier had no dedicated space. There were no long pauses, no formal rituals that lasted more than a few hours. Bodies had to be buried quickly. Work resumed almost immediately. Fires needed tending. Animals still required care. Grief was folded into labor, compressed into brief moments between tasks. People learned to carry it without displaying it. Widows and widowers adapted out of necessity. Roles shifted. Skills were learned quickly or not at all. Children took on responsibilities earlier than intended. Mistakes were made. Some were fatal. Others simply made life harder. Survival after loss was not heroic. It was practical and uneven. Loneliness settled in quietly. Long stretches passed without conversation. Silence became familiar. People spoke less, not because they had nothing to say, but because there was no one left who needed to hear it. Thoughts stayed internal longer. Decisions were made alone, without reassurance or argument. This independence looked like strength from a distance. Up close, it was simply isolation. Physical recovery was slow and incomplete. Injuries healed improperly. Malnutrition left lasting weakness. People learned to accept limitations they would have once tried to overcome. Heavy work was avoided when possible. Rest was taken more often, though guilt usually accompanied it. Survival required accepting reduced capacity without interpreting it as failure. Some survivors developed routines that bordered on ritual. Same tasks, same order, same times each day. These routines were not efficient. They were stabilizing. Predictability replaced hope. If tomorrow looked like today, then tomorrow could be endured. Change was viewed cautiously, not as opportunity but as risk. Communities that formed from shared loss were quiet ones. People bonded without much explanation. They recognized familiar fatigue in each other. Conversations were brief and practical. Trust developed slowly. But once established, it was rarely questioned. These connections were functional rather than emotional, built on reliability rather than comfort. Memory behaved differently after prolonged survival. Events blurred together. Years collapsed into impressions rather than timelines. People remembered conditions rather than dates. Cold, hunger, absence. What was forgotten were the beginnings and endings. Life became a series of ongoing adjustments with no clear milestones. Some survivors eventually left the frontier. They returned east or moved toward established towns. These transitions were not celebrations. They were cautious withdrawals. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, even when it was necessary. Many carried a sense of unfinished business, as if survival alone was not sufficient justification for leaving. Those who stayed often did so because leaving required energy they no longer had. The frontier became familiar, if not forgiving. Hardship was expected. Predictability emerged from difficulty itself. Once expectations were low enough, disappointment became manageable. Stories of these survivors were rarely recorded in detail. There was nothing dramatic to highlight, no final moment, no clear victory. Survival extended quietly into ordinary life, which did not make for compelling retellings. What remained were brief mentions, names in records, indications that someone continued. Over time, endurance was mistaken for success. Longevity was treated as proof of adaptation. In reality, many survived simply because conditions stabilized temporarily. A few good seasons, a reliable water source, a stretch of relative calm. Survival depended heavily on circumstances that could not be planned. When frontier life finally loosened its grip on these people, it did so gradually. They aged faster than expected. Bodies failed earlier. Energy declined. What they carried forward was not pride, but familiarity with discomfort. Later, hardships felt different, not easier, but recognizable. In the next part, we will look at survival stories that were shaped not by loss of people, but by loss of direction. Moments when the frontier did not take lives immediately, but removed certainty, leaving people alive but unanchored. For now, you can rest. Endurance does not end loudly, it just keeps going. Some frontier survival stories were shaped not by loss of people, but by loss of direction. Travelers who remained alive, supplied, and physically capable still found themselves uncertain about where they were going, why they were still moving, or when they should stop. The frontier had a way of removing reference points without removing responsibility. Routes were missed easily. Trails forked without warning. Landmarks looked familiar until they didn't. A river bend resembled another river bend. A ridge looked like the one crossed days earlier. Small navigational errors compounded quietly. By the time doubt became serious, energy had already been spent correcting earlier mistakes. Maps offered limited reassurance. They were often outdated, incomplete, or optimistic. Distances were simplified. Elevation was understated. Rivers were drawn as stable lines instead of unpredictable systems. People followed these maps carefully and still ended up somewhere they did not recognize. This mismatch between expectation and reality created a specific kind of anxiety that did not fade quickly. Leadership faltered under uncertainty. Leaders were expected to know where they were going, even when no one realistically could. Confidence mattered more than accuracy. Some leaders continued forward to avoid admitting doubt. Others hesitated too long, waiting for clarity that never arrived. Groups suffered under both approaches. Time perception deteriorated. Days blurred together. Without clear milestones, progress felt imagined rather than real. People began measuring success by survival rather than movement. Did everyone wake up today? Was there still water? Was the fire lit? These became the primary indicators of accomplishment. Direction became secondary. Psychological strain increased gradually. Doubt settled in without a clear cause. People questioned past decisions constantly. What if they had taken a different route? What if they had left earlier? What if they had turned back? These questions had no answers, but they consumed energy anyway. Survival became mentally exhausting even when physical conditions stabilized. Some individuals responded by clinging to routines. Same departure time, same travel order, same rest intervals. These habits created a sense of control that direction no longer provided. Others disengaged almost entirely, following along without involvement. Responsibility felt heavier than passivity. Survival did not require enthusiasm, only participation. The environment reinforced disorientation. Weather obscured landmarks. Dust and snow erased tracks. Night travel removed visual reference entirely. Sound traveled unpredictably. A distant river could be heard, but not reached. A nearby campfire could disappear behind a rise. The land offered signals without guidance. Occasionally, people encountered signs of others: abandoned camps, broken tools, shallow graves. These did not clarify direction. They only confirmed that others had been equally uncertain. Survival stories rarely mention the comfort of seeing these traces, because there often wasn't any. They reminded travelers how easily progress could end. Some survival depended on stopping entirely. Groups paused for days or weeks, not because conditions were dangerous, but because direction was unclear. Waiting felt unproductive, but movement without understanding felt worse. These pauses were difficult to justify and even harder to endure. Stillness carried its own risks, but it also prevented compounding mistakes. Those who eventually regained direction often did so accidentally. A river led somewhere useful, a trail reappeared, another group passed through and offered information. Rarely was direction recovered through planning alone. It arrived through chance, patience, or both. Survival was less about correcting course and more about enduring until the course corrected itself. People who lived through prolonged disorientation often described it as more damaging than hunger or cold. Physical discomfort had limits, uncertainty did not. It occupied every decision and extended into rest. Sleep offered no relief because there was no sense of completion at the end of the day. When direction finally returned, it did not restore optimism. It restored functionality. People moved again. Tasks regained purpose. The future reappeared in small increments rather than grand visions. Survival continued without resolution, but with less mental strain. In later retellings, these periods of uncertainty were shortened or omitted entirely. Stories prefer momentum. They skip the waiting, the doubt, and the unproductive days. But for those who lived through them, these were the longest parts. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing resolved. In the next part, we will look at survival stories shaped by a different kind of imbalance. Not confusion, but false confidence. Moments when people believed the worst was over, just before the frontier corrected them. For now, you can rest. Direction is fragile. It disappears quietly and returns without apology. False confidence did not announce itself loudly. It arrived gradually, after things had gone slightly better for a short while. A few calm days, decent weather, food that lasted longer than expected. People began to relax, not because conditions were good, but because they were briefly less bad. This shift in perception often mattered more than the conditions themselves. Survivors mistook stability for safety. Camps were improved. Supplies were used more freely. Rations were loosened just a little. Energy that had been tightly controlled was spent more casually. The body responded positively at first. People felt stronger. Movement became easier. Conversation returned in short bursts. Confidence followed. This confidence encouraged risk. Routes that had been avoided were attempted again. Rivers were crossed at less cautious points. Travel resumed during uncertain weather. Decisions that once required discussion were made quickly. Speed felt efficient. Efficiency felt intelligent. The frontier had a habit of letting this belief settle before correcting it. Weather changed suddenly. A mild stretch ended without warning. Storms arrived earlier than expected. Heat returned stronger. Cold came sharper. People who had adjusted their behavior during calmer periods were caught unprepared. Firewood was low. Shelter was incomplete. Clothing was inadequate. Supplies that should have been conserved were already gone. Injury followed closely behind renewed activity. Muscles strained. Old wounds reopened. Fatigue returned more quickly than before. Bodies that had not fully recovered were pushed too hard. Survival after false confidence was more difficult than initial survival because it required accepting that improvement had been temporary. Animals suffered similarly. Those that had regained strength were overworked. Loads were increased. Rest periods shortened. When animals collapsed again, they did so more completely. The loss felt heavier this time because it followed hope rather than desperation. The frontier was particularly effective at removing resources just after people began to rely on them again. Psychologically, false confidence created a sharper drop when it failed. Earlier hardship was expected. Later hardship felt unfair. People asked why things had improved, only to worsen again. The land offered no explanation. It did not acknowledge progress. It responded only to conditions, not effort. Groups often fractured during these moments. Optimists blamed pessimists for slowing progress earlier. Pessimists blamed optimists for pushing too hard. Trust eroded quickly. Decisions became reactive rather than deliberate. Arguments resumed with more bitterness than before, because disappointment carried weight that fear alone did not. Some individuals recognized the pattern too late. They noticed that confidence had been doing the work that caution used to do. By the time restraint returned, damage had already been done. Supplies were lower. Energy was gone. Options were narrower. Survival resumed under worse conditions than before the false improvement. Others survived specifically because they resisted confidence. They remained cautious even when circumstances improved. They continued rationing. They rested when movement seemed possible. They prepared for reversal rather than continuation. This behavior was often criticized at the time. It looked unnecessary. Later, it appeared quietly reasonable. False confidence also shaped memory. Survivors remembered the good days more clearly than the bad ones. These moments stood out precisely because they were rare. Later retellings focused on them disproportionately. Listeners heard about progress, hope, and near success. The reversal that followed was shortened or explained away. The frontier did not reward optimism consistently enough to make it useful. It rewarded adaptability. People who survived longest were those who treated improvement as temporary by default. They expected conditions to change. They planned for regression rather than advancement. This mindset was not inspiring, but it was effective. In many cases, the worst moments occurred after people believed they were past the worst. A late storm, a delayed illness, a final stretch that took longer than expected. Survival stories often hinge on these turns, though they are rarely framed as consequences of confidence. They are framed as misfortune. For the people involved, the lesson was simple and uncomfortable. Feeling better did not mean being safe. Improvement did not indicate progress. Survival required treating relief as suspicious and calm as temporary. This awareness did not make life easier. It made it more manageable. In the next part, we will look at survival stories where even confidence and caution stopped mattering. Moments when the frontier reduced survival to waiting, with no action left to take except endurance. For now, you can rest. Confidence fades quickly. The consequences tend to last longer. There were moments in frontier survival when action stopped being useful. Movement no longer improved outcomes. Decisions had already been made, resources already spent, routes already chosen. What remained was waiting. Not hopeful waiting, not strategic waiting, just waiting because there was nothing else left that could be done without making things worse. Waiting took many forms. Storms that trapped people for days or weeks. Illnesses that required rest rather than effort. Rivers that could not be crossed until levels changed. Snow that made travel pointless. Heat that forced inactivity during daylight. These pauses were not planned. They were imposed, and they disrupted the idea that survival required constant motion. For people used to equating effort with progress, waiting felt wrong. Doing nothing felt dangerous. Anxiety increased not because conditions were worsening, but because control had diminished. People checked supplies repeatedly. They walked the same small area over and over. They started tasks without finishing them. Activity became symbolic rather than effective. Food consumption changed during these periods. Rations were eaten slowly, deliberately, with attention to each portion. Meals became events, not because they were satisfying, but because they broke the monotony. Hunger sharpened awareness. The sound of chewing felt louder. Swallowing took more concentration. People noticed how quickly even small amounts disappeared. Conversation thinned out. There was little to discuss that hadn't already been discussed. Plans could not be revised because circumstances had not changed. People spoke only when necessary. Silence filled the rest of the time. This silence was not peaceful. It was tense and watchful, broken occasionally by weather, coughing, or movement outside shelter. Sleep during prolonged waiting was uneven. People slept too much or not enough. Dreams became vivid and confusing. Past and present mixed together. Some woke unsure of where they were for a few seconds. Others lay awake counting time without knowing what they were counting toward. Waiting distorted the sense of future entirely. Physical condition often declined despite inactivity. Muscles weakened. Circulation slowed. Illness lingered. Injuries healed slowly. The body needed movement, but movement was not always possible or safe. This created a quiet contradiction. Rest was required, but rest also caused deterioration. Survival balanced awkwardly between the two. Morale behaved unpredictably. Some people became calmer during waiting, accepting the lack of control and conserving emotional energy. Others deteriorated quickly, becoming restless, irritable, or withdrawn. There was no consistent psychological response. Survival stories later simplify this period as endurance. Lived honestly, it was instability without drama. Weather dominated attention. People watched clouds carefully. They measured wind by sound. They noticed subtle shifts in temperature. These observations became meaningful because they were the only indicators of change. A clearing sky suggested movement might resume. Continued cloud cover suggested more waiting. These small signs carried disproportionate emotional weight. In groups, waiting tested relationships quietly. There was no distraction from personalities. Small habits became noticeable. Breathing, eating speed, sleep patterns. Annoyances accumulated without release. Arguments sometimes erupted suddenly, not because of a single issue, but because tension had nowhere else to go. Other times, people withdrew completely to avoid conflict. Waiting also forced reflection, whether welcomed or not. People revisited earlier decisions repeatedly. What if they had turned back sooner? What if they had waited earlier instead of pushing forward? These questions had no utility, but they occupied the mind anyway. Survival did not require answers. It required tolerating the questions. Some survival outcomes depended entirely on waiting correctly. Leaving too early could be fatal. Staying too long could be equally dangerous. Timing mattered, but information was limited. People guessed. Sometimes they guessed right. Often they did not. Later stories attribute success to judgment. In reality, it was often coincidence. When waiting finally ended, it rarely did so cleanly. Conditions improved slightly rather than completely. Storms weakened instead of disappearing. Water levels dropped just enough. Heat receded only during certain hours. Movement resumed cautiously, with lingering uncertainty. Waiting did not resolve danger. It only altered its form. Those who survived prolonged waiting often described it as the hardest part, not because of pain or fear, but because of suspension. Life paused without permission. Progress was delayed without explanation. Survival required accepting inactivity without interpreting it as failure. In later retellings, waiting is often skipped. Stories jump from crisis to resolution. The days in between are compressed into a sentence or two. But for those who lived through them, these days stretched endlessly, not because nothing happened, but because nothing moved forward. In the next part, we will look at survival stories where waiting finally ended, not in relief, but in another difficult adjustment. Re-entry, reaching safety and discovering that survival itself had changed the meaning of what safety felt like. For now, you can rest. Waiting does not feel productive. It simply continues until it doesn't. When waiting finally ended, and people reached something that could reasonably be called safety, the change was not immediate relief. It was adjustment. Survival did not stop simply because danger lessened. It shifted into a different form, one that was harder to explain and slower to resolve. Re-entry was awkward. Bodies that had adapted to scarcity reacted poorly to abundance. Food caused discomfort. Rest felt excessive and unsettling. People woke repeatedly at night, listening for sounds that were no longer relevant. Muscles remained tense without purpose. The body had learned vigilance too well to abandon it quickly. Social reintegration was uneven. Survivors struggled to explain what had happened, not because they lacked details, but because the details felt incompatible with normal conversation. Questions were asked politely and answered briefly. Longer explanations felt unnecessary or exhausting. Listeners often wanted conclusions. Survivors had none to offer. Time perception remained distorted. People who had waited for weeks or months without progress found ordinary schedules strange. Meals at fixed times felt artificial. Days structured around clocks rather than conditions required relearning. Survival had trained attention outward. Safety required attention inward again, which took effort. Emotions surfaced unpredictably. Relief arrived late, sometimes weeks after danger had passed. Grief followed no schedule. People cried unexpectedly or not at all. The absence of immediate emotion worried observers, but it was not uncommon. Survival delayed reaction. Feelings waited until effort was no longer required. Physical consequences lingered. Weight returned slowly. Strength rebuilt unevenly. Some injuries never healed properly. Illnesses left lasting weakness. Survivors learned to live with reduced capacity, often without complaint. The frontier had recalibrated expectations downward. Ordinary limitations no longer felt remarkable. Memory adjusted itself. Some events sharpened over time. Others faded completely. Survivors remembered textures, temperatures, and sounds more clearly than sequences or dates. Stories became impressionistic rather than chronological. This frustrated historians later. It made perfect sense to the people involved. Safety also introduced choice, which had been largely absent during survival. Choices created uncertainty of a different kind. What to do next, where to go, whether to stay. During survival, options were constrained. Afterward, they expanded abruptly. This expansion was not always welcome. Responsibility returned suddenly, without guidance. Some survivors avoided planning altogether. They took small, immediate steps. Work, shelter, routine. Long-term thinking felt unnecessary and uncomfortable. The future had been unreliable once. There was little incentive to trust it again. Others attempted to return to frontier life despite reaching safety. Familiar hardship felt preferable to unfamiliar comfort. The frontier was difficult, but it was known. Settlements required adaptation to social rules, expectations, and rhythms that no longer fit easily. Survival had reshaped behavior in ways that did not reverse cleanly. Communities received survivors with mixed responses. Admiration existed, but it was abstract. Practical support was limited. The frontier had normalized loss. Everyone had endured something. Individual survival stories blended into a larger background of hardship. There was little space for prolonged attention. Over time, survivors learned to function rather than resolve. They worked, they aged, they participated. They did not necessarily heal. Survival did not guarantee closure. It guaranteed continuation. This distinction mattered less in daily life than it did in memory. Later retellings compressed this phase significantly. Stories ended at rescue or arrival. Safety was treated as conclusion. The slow recalibration that followed was omitted. It lacked drama. It lacked clear conflict. It did not fit neatly into narrative structure. For those who lived it, re-entry was not an ending. It was another form of endurance, one that required patience rather than effort, adjustment rather than action. Survival had trained them to persist under pressure. Safety required learning how to persist without it. Some never fully adjusted. They remained restless. They preferred movement to stability, silence to conversation. Predictability felt fragile. They lived cautiously, as if improvement could reverse at any moment. In a sense, they were not wrong. The frontier did not release people completely. Even after they left it, it followed them in habits, expectations, and limits. Survival became a permanent reference point. Later difficulties were measured against it. Some seemed smaller. Others felt sharper because they were no longer buffered by necessity. In the next part, we will look at how these survival stories were later reshaped, simplified, and repurposed. How endurance became legend and discomfort became character. Not because the truth was forgotten, but because it was inconvenient. For now, you can rest. Safety does not end survival. It just changes what survival asks for. Once frontier survival stories began to circulate beyond the people who lived them, they changed shape. Details were removed. Timelines were simplified. Long periods of waiting, doubt, and weakness were compressed into brief transitions. What remained was a cleaner version, easier to repeat, and easier to admire. Endurance was reframed as character. Suffering became evidence of strength rather than circumstance. Survival was explained through determination instead of timing, weather, or luck. The frontier, which had been unpredictable and indifferent, was turned into a challenge that could be met through the right attitude. This interpretation was comforting, but inaccurate. Discomfort was selectively edited. Hunger became resolve. Exhaustion became grit. Fear became bravery. The moments that did not fit this framing were quietly removed. Waiting without progress, making the wrong choice, and surviving anyway. Doing nothing because nothing else was possible. These details complicated the story and were therefore unnecessary. Individual survival stories were also isolated from their surroundings. They were told as personal journeys rather than as outcomes shaped by group dynamics, geography, and chance. This isolation made success appear repeatable. It implied that similar effort would yield similar results. The frontier itself remained largely unexamined. Names were preserved more often than conditions. Survivors were remembered, but what they endured was softened. Weather became background. Illness was mentioned briefly. Loss was acknowledged without dwelling. The frontier's role as an active force faded, replaced by a stage on which people proved themselves. Failure, when mentioned at all, was framed as error. People who did not survive were described as unprepared, reckless, or unlucky. The idea that the same choices could lead to different outcomes under slightly different conditions was rarely explored. Survival stories prefer clarity. The frontier did not provide it. These simplified narratives were useful. They justified expansion. They encouraged movement. They reassured people that hardship could be managed with effort. They turned endurance into something aspirational rather than cautionary. In doing so, they made the frontier seem more predictable than it ever was. For the survivors themselves, this retelling often felt distant. They recognized their experiences only vaguely in the stories that circulated later. The emotions were different. The emphasis was misplaced. What they remembered most clearly was not triumph, but persistence without certainty. That did not translate well. Some survivors participated in the reshaping willingly. They learned which details were welcome and which were not. They shortened explanations. They avoided uncomfortable specifics. Over time, their own memories adjusted slightly to match the stories they told most often. Survival became narrative through repetition. Others withdrew from retelling entirely. They did not correct inaccuracies. They did not argue with simplified versions. Explanation required energy. Silence required less. Their survival continued quietly, unremarkable and largely unrecorded. As generations passed, the distance widened. Survival stories were taught rather than remembered. They became examples rather than accounts. The frontier transformed from an environment into a concept. Brutality became implied rather than described. Endurance became admirable rather than costly. What was lost in this process was not respect, but accuracy. The frontier was not a test designed to reveal strength. It was a system that applied pressure unevenly and without explanation. People survived for many reasons, few of which were consistent or replicable. Understanding this does not diminish survival. It clarifies it. Endurance becomes less about personal virtue and more about human adaptability under constraint. Survival stories become records of persistence rather than proof of superiority. This interpretation is less inspiring, but more honest. The frontier, as remembered, is quieter than it was lived. Its brutality is present, but softened. Its randomness is acknowledged only briefly. What remains is a shape that fits comfortably into explanation, even if it no longer matches experience. In the next part, we will return to the stories themselves, one final time. Not to dramatize them further, but to sit with what they were at their core. Long stretches of discomfort endured without promise, meaning, or clear reward. For now, you can rest. Stories change with distance. The experience they came from does not. At their core, the most brutal survival stories of the American frontier were not narratives of conquest or transformation. They were experiences of duration. People stayed alive for long periods under conditions that did not improve and often did not make sense. Survival was not a moment. It was a sequence of ordinary days endured without expectation of reward. What made these stories brutal was not constant danger, but sustained discomfort, hunger that never quite disappeared, cold or heat that became background noise, fatigue that shaped posture, speech, and thought. People adjusted to these conditions gradually, without noticing the exact moment when discomfort became normal. Hope existed, but it was restrained. It focused on short distances rather than distant futures. Tomorrow's weather, the next meal, the next river crossing. Long-term plans were postponed repeatedly, not out of pessimism, but practicality. Survival narrowed attention to what could be influenced immediately. Skill mattered, but less than is often assumed. Knowledge helped, but it was incomplete. Preparation reduced risk, but did not eliminate it. Many people did everything correctly and still suffered. Others made serious mistakes and survived anyway. The frontier did not behave like a test with consistent grading. The body adapted unevenly. Some people tolerated hunger better. Others handled cold more effectively. Illness affected individuals differently. These variations shaped outcomes quietly, without moral significance. Survival favored certain traits temporarily, then shifted its preferences without warning. Social bonds mattered most when they were functional rather than emotional. Cooperation reduced effort. Shared labor conserved energy. Conflict increased risk. Groups that survived longest often did so by minimizing complexity rather than maximizing harmony. Clear roles, limited discussion, predictable routines. Silence played a larger role than memory later suggested. Long periods passed without conversation. People saved words the way they saved supplies. This quiet was not reflective or peaceful. It was economical. Speaking required energy. Silence conserved it. The environment remained indifferent throughout. The frontier did not respond to effort, suffering, or intention. It changed according to patterns that were partially understood at best. Survival required accepting this indifference without personalizing it. Those who interpreted hardship as punishment often lost focus. Those who treated it as condition endured longer. What survivors carried forward was not insight so much as tolerance. They learned how little comfort was necessary to continue. They learned how much uncertainty could be absorbed. This knowledge was not often shared explicitly. It appeared later in behavior, restraint, and lowered expectations. When these people eventually spoke about survival, they often struggled to convey its texture. Words were too large or too small. Saying it was difficult sounded exaggerated. Saying it was manageable sounded dishonest. The truth occupied a narrow space between, and it was hard to maintain. The frontier did not produce clarity. It produced continuation. People lived because they did not stop. They adjusted because stopping was rarely an option. Survival was not chosen repeatedly. It was defaulted into one day at a time. In understanding these stories this way, their brutality becomes quieter but more complete. They were not tests meant to be passed. They were conditions endured. The people involved were not symbols. They were individuals responding to pressure with limited information and fewer alternatives. In the next part, we will move toward closing this series by considering what these stories are useful for now, not as lessons in bravery, but as reminders of how endurance actually works when comfort is removed and meaning is delayed. For now, you can rest. The frontier did not ask people to be exceptional. It asked them to continue. When the most brutal frontier survival stories are stripped of drama, what remains is not instruction and not inspiration. What remains is a pattern of human behavior under sustained pressure. These stories are useful, not because they tell us what to do, but because they show what happens when comfort, certainty, and explanation are removed all at once. Endurance, in these accounts, is not driven by belief. People did not survive because they were convinced things would improve. They survived because improvement was not required for continuation. The body and mind adjusted downward, reducing needs until persistence became possible again. This adjustment happened quietly, without ceremony. Modern retellings often search for lessons, but frontier survival rarely offered clean ones. Planning helped until it didn't. Courage mattered until it became irrelevant. Cooperation worked until fatigue interfered. The frontier punished consistency and rewarded flexibility. But even flexibility had limits. Survival depended on responding, not mastering. What these stories reveal most clearly is the human ability to tolerate uncertainty longer than expected. People lived without knowing when food would arrive, when weather would change, or when movement would resume. They made decisions without feedback and lived with the outcomes without explanation. This tolerance did not make them calm, it made them functional. Another quiet takeaway is how quickly standards shift. What once felt unacceptable became routine. Sleeping in wet clothes, eating minimal meals, accepting constant discomfort. These changes did not feel like progress. They felt like necessity. Survival does not elevate experience. It compresses it. The frontier also demonstrated how fragile meaning can be. Purpose narrowed to immediate tasks. Larger goals faded temporarily. People stopped asking why they were there and focused on how to get through the day. Meaning was postponed rather than abandoned. It returned later, if conditions allowed. This postponement is often misunderstood as strength. In reality, it was adaptation. Meaning requires stability. Survival required suspending it. People who insisted on understanding their suffering often exhausted themselves faster than those who treated it as condition rather than narrative. These stories also show how little control individuals actually had. Outcomes depended on weather, timing, health, and chance encounters. Individual effort mattered, but it operated within narrow boundaries. Survival was cooperative between human capacity and external allowance. Neither worked alone. When viewed this way, frontier survival becomes less romantic but more accurate. It is not a story of domination over nature. It is a story of negotiation with limitation. People survived not by winning, but by losing less than expected. This perspective does not diminish those who endured it. It clarifies them. They were not exceptional because they triumphed. They were ordinary people who continued under conditions that offered no encouragement. Their endurance was not loud. It was repetitive and uncelebrated. In the present, these stories are often used as metaphors for resilience, for grit, for determination. These metaphors are incomplete. Frontier survival was not a mindset exercise. It was a sustained exposure to constraint. The mindset followed the conditions, not the other way around. Understanding this makes the stories quieter but more respectful. It removes judgment from those who did not survive. It removes credit from those who did. It places attention where it belongs, on the environment, the circumstances, and the narrow margins within which people operated. What the frontier ultimately demonstrates is that survival does not require optimism, clarity, or even hope. It requires continuation when stopping offers no advantage. This is not inspiring, it is simply human. In the final part, we will bring this series to rest, not with conclusions, but with acceptance, an acknowledgement that the most brutal survival stories are not meant to be resolved neatly. They are meant to be endured, remembered imperfectly, and left without embellishment. For now, you can rest. The frontier does not need interpretation. It already said what it meant. The most brutal survival stories of the American frontier do not end with triumph. They end with continuation. People lived on, not because something meaningful had been achieved, but because life simply carried forward once the pressure eased enough to allow it. Survival did not transform them. It reduced them, then let them rebuild slowly, unevenly, and without ceremony. What stands out in the quiet after these stories is how little explanation remains. There is no final lesson that applies cleanly, no rule that guarantees survival next time. The frontier did not reward insight consistently enough to make insight reliable. It allowed some people to persist and did not allow others, often for reasons that were never clear. This absence of clarity is uncomfortable, which is why it is often avoided. Stories prefer endings that justify suffering. Frontier survival rarely offered justification. People endured because endurance was the only remaining option, meaning, if it returned at all, came much later and looked different than expected. Those who survived did not describe themselves as changed in dramatic ways. They did not claim wisdom or superiority. They spoke of fatigue, of habits they never lost, of preferences shaped quietly by scarcity. They carried survival forward in small ways, not as identity, but as adjustment. The frontier itself faded faster than the experience of it. Towns grew, trails became roads, hardship was replaced with infrastructure, but the memory of prolonged discomfort lingered in behavior, not storytelling. People conserved, they hesitated, they avoided excess. These traits were practical, not symbolic. Over time, the brutality of survival became historical rather than personal. It was referenced rather than remembered. The silence, the waiting, the uncertainty were replaced by summaries. This made the past easier to hold, but less accurate. What was lost was not drama, but duration. If there is anything these stories offer now, it is perspective, not inspiration, but calibration. A reminder that human endurance often operates without confidence, without clarity, and without assurance of improvement. Survival does not require belief. It requires tolerance for conditions that cannot be fixed immediately. This tolerance is not admirable in a heroic sense. It is functional. It allows life to continue when conditions remove other options. The frontier demanded this kind of endurance repeatedly, and people responded because stopping rarely offered relief. In resting with these stories, there is no need to extract lessons or metaphors. They are complete as they are, long, uneven, quietly brutal, remembered imperfectly, because that is how they were lived. And so, we let them settle where they belong, not as legends of strength, but as records of persistence under constraint, not as guidance, but as context, not as conclusions, but as continuation. For now, you can rest. The frontier does not ask to be understood. It only reminds us that survival is often quieter than we expect, and longer than we would prefer. Long after the frontier had been crossed, settled, or abandoned, its survival stories continued to exist in ordinary habits. People who had endured long stretches of uncertainty tended to live cautiously afterward. They saved more than they spent. They wasted little. They preferred predictability, not because it was comforting, but because unpredictability had already taken enough from them. Sleep patterns changed permanently for some. Light sleepers remained light sleepers. Sudden sounds caused alertness instead of annoyance. Waking early felt safer than sleeping late. These were not conscious choices. They were carried forward automatically, long after the original danger had passed. Food was treated differently. Even in times of abundance, portions stayed modest. Leftovers were valued. Spoilage caused disproportionate frustration. Hunger had recalibrated expectations in ways that did not reverse. Eating was appreciated quietly, without celebration, as something functional rather than indulgent. Conversation styles shifted as well. People who had learned to conserve words rarely returned to casual speech. They spoke directly. They avoided speculation. Silence did not bother them. They were comfortable leaving things unsaid, because survival had taught them that not everything needed explanation. Emotional restraint was often mistaken for hardness. In reality, it was efficiency. Expressing fear, anger, or hope had once required energy that could not be spared. That habit persisted. Feelings were still present, but they moved more slowly, surfaced less often, and stayed contained. These quiet changes were rarely recognized as outcomes of survival. They blended into personality over time. People were described as practical, reserved, or cautious, without reference to why. The frontier did not announce its influence. It embedded itself gradually. When later generations asked about survival, answers were brief. Details felt unnecessary. Those who had endured did not feel obligated to educate. The experience belonged to a context that no longer existed. Explaining it fully would have required reconstructing conditions that words could not easily recreate. Some attempted explanation anyway. They spoke of cold nights, empty days, and waiting without knowing how long waiting would last. Listeners nodded politely. then returned to their own concerns. The scale of endurance did not transfer easily. It was understood intellectually, but not felt. Over time, the frontier became symbolic. It stood for effort, ambition, and resilience. The quieter realities faded. This was not deliberate dishonesty. It was simplification. Long discomfort does not translate well into brief memory. It resists summary. What remains most accurate about these survival stories is their lack of climax. There is no single moment that defines them. They are made of accumulation, small decisions, repeated adjustments, minor discomforts layered until they become defining. Survival happened gradually, and so did its effects. In this way, the frontier's brutality extended beyond the period of danger itself. It shaped lives long afterward, not through trauma alone, but through habit. Survival rewrote defaults. It changed what felt normal, acceptable, or sufficient. These changes were not regretted. They were not celebrated either. They simply existed. People lived with them because they had learned how to live with worse. This knowledge did not make life easy. It made it manageable. In the next part, we will slow even further and look at what silence itself meant in frontier survival. Not silence as peace, but silence as space, as absence, as something that shaped thought more than speech ever could. For now, you can rest. Some stories do not move forward anymore. They settle, quietly, into the way people live. Silence on the frontier was rarely peaceful. It was expansive, persistent, and difficult to escape. There were long periods when nothing happened loudly enough to interrupt thought. No conversation, no movement beyond wind or distant animals. In these stretches, silence did not soothe. It amplified. Without distraction, the mind turned inward repeatedly. People replayed decisions without resolution. They imagined outcomes they could not verify. They worried about things that could not be acted upon. Silence removed urgency, but it did not remove concern. It allowed uncertainty to echo. Sound, when it arrived, carried disproportionate weight. A branch breaking, an animal moving nearby, a change in wind direction. These noises were not interpreted casually. They were evaluated, assessed, placed into context immediately. Silence trained attention in a way constant activity never could. Speech became deliberate. Words were chosen carefully, not for politeness, but for efficiency. Saying something meant breaking silence, and breaking silence required justification. This habit remained even when silence was no longer necessary. People spoke only when speech served a purpose. Silence also removed performance. There was no audience, no reaction, no reassurance. Survival happened without acknowledgement. People endured without anyone witnessing it. This absence changed how effort felt. Actions were done because they were required, not because they would be seen or remembered. Loneliness behaved differently in silence. It was not always emotional. Sometimes it was logistical. No one to trade with, no one to confirm decisions, no one to share responsibility. Silence emphasized self-reliance, but it also exposed its limits. Everyone needed confirmation eventually. Silence delayed it. Children experienced silence unevenly. Some adapted quickly. Others struggled visibly. Play became quieter. Questions became fewer. Silence aged them subtly, not through hardship alone, but through reduced feedback. They learned early that not every thought needed expression. Silence also blurred time. Without markers, days stretched and compressed unpredictably. Hours felt longer. Weeks felt indistinct. People remembered silence as duration rather than moment. It was not a pause between events. It was the setting in which everything else occurred. For some, silence became preferable. Noise felt intrusive afterward. Crowded places caused discomfort. Conversation required adjustment. The frontier had trained them to exist without constant input. Silence became familiar, even necessary, for comfort. This preference was often misunderstood later. People were described as withdrawn or distant. In reality, they were accustomed to processing internally. Silence was not absence. It was space. Space to think, to wait, to endure without interruption. In survival stories, silence is rarely mentioned directly. It does not advance plot. It does not dramatize events. Yet it shaped every decision. It framed every fear. It stretched every moment of uncertainty into something larger than itself. The frontier did not demand silence, but it produced it. Distance, isolation, and uncertainty created an environment where quiet dominated by default. Survival happened within that quiet, not alongside it. Understanding this does not add excitement to these stories. It adds accuracy. The most brutal part of survival was not always pain or danger. It was the absence of response, acting without feedback, enduring without acknowledgement. In the next part, we will let even this quiet recede slightly and consider how ordinary life resumed around people who had been shaped by such prolonged silence, and how they carried it with them without naming it. For now, you can rest. Silence does not end when danger passes. It follows, quietly, into whatever comes next. When frontier survivors returned to places with regular noise, movement, and conversation, the transition was subtle but uneven. Towns felt crowded, voices overlapped, sounds arrived constantly, without pause. What once would have been considered normal now felt excessive. The world seemed impatient, always speaking before listening. Daily life resumed its routines quickly. Work schedules, social expectations, small talk. Survivors participated without resistance, but not always with ease. Conversation moved faster than their thoughts. Decisions were made with confidence that felt unfamiliar. People expected explanations immediately. The frontier had trained patience, not speed. Noise required adjustment, doors closing, tools striking surfaces, animals moving nearby. These sounds triggered attention automatically, even when they no longer signaled danger. The body responded before the mind could reassure it. Over time, this alertness faded slightly, but it never disappeared completely. Ordinary problems felt different after prolonged survival. Minor inconveniences were tolerated easily. Larger frustrations, especially those involving uncertainty, were not. Waiting in lines, delays without explanation, promises that might not be kept. These situations reintroduced a familiar tension, even though the stakes were lower. Relationships also shifted. Survivors listened more than they spoke. They interrupted less. They did not rush to fill silence. This was sometimes interpreted as detachment. In reality, it was habit. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt complete enough on its own. Some struggled with abundance. Too many choices created discomfort rather than relief. Selecting food, clothing, or direction required energy that survival had trained them to conserve. Simplicity felt safer. Fewer options reduced the need for constant evaluation. Others found ordinary life strangely fragile. Comfort depended on systems that could fail. Supply chains, social order, predictable schedules. Survivors had learned how quickly structure could disappear. This awareness did not create paranoia. It created caution. They trusted systems, but not absolutely. Storytelling became selective. Survivors learned quickly which details were welcome and which caused discomfort. They shortened accounts. They softened edges. Over time, even these shortened versions were shared less often. The experience remained, but discussion faded. Children who grew up around survivors absorbed these patterns indirectly. Conservatism, preparedness, preference for routine. These traits were passed on without explanation. Survival shaped families quietly, without being named as such. As years passed, the frontier receded further into history. Infrastructure replaced hardship. Roads smoothed paths that once required endurance. The gap between experience and environment widened. Survivors adjusted, but the contrast remained. What they carried forward was not fear, but calibration. They knew how little was truly required to continue. They recognized when discomfort was tolerable and when it was dangerous. This awareness rarely surfaced in words. It appeared in decisions. The frontier did not remain present as memory alone. It became a reference point. Later challenges were measured against it. Some felt smaller. Others felt different. Not easier, but familiar in structure. Uncertainty no longer felt abstract. It had texture. Eventually, survival blended into life so thoroughly that it became difficult to separate the two. There was no moment when endurance officially ended. It simply became less visible. The frontier stopped demanding attention, but it did not stop shaping response. In the next part, we will slow one final time and consider how time itself softened these stories further, and what remains once both danger and memory have faded enough to feel distant. For now, you can rest. Survival does not disappear when conditions improve. It settles, quietly, into the way people move through ordinary days. As years passed, the frontier survival stories changed again, not through retelling this time, but through distance. Time softened memory in a way no editor ever could. Sharp details dulled. Sequences rearranged themselves. What remained was not accuracy, but familiarity. The experience became something that had happened, rather than something that was still happening. For many survivors, memory did not fade evenly. Certain moments stayed vivid without explanation. The texture of cold air at night, the sound of water finally being found, the weight of hunger when it crossed from discomfort into weakness. Other details vanished completely. Names were forgotten, dates dissolved, long stretches of waiting collapsed into a single impression. This uneven memory made storytelling difficult. Survivors felt confident about how something felt, but uncertain about when it occurred or why. Listeners often expected structure: beginning, middle, end. Survival did not provide that shape. It offered repetition instead. Explaining repetition rarely held attention for long. As memory softened, judgment softened with it. Decisions that once felt heavy became less charged. Mistakes no longer carried the same emotional weight. People stopped replaying alternatives as often. The past became less negotiable. It was no longer something to solve. It was something to acknowledge. Time also changed how loss was carried. Grief did not disappear, but it integrated. It became quieter, less urgent. It surfaced in predictable moments rather than unexpectedly. Anniversaries, weather changes, familiar tasks. Loss remained present without demanding attention constantly. The frontier itself transformed in parallel. Places once associated with danger became ordinary. Trails became roads. Campsites became towns. Landscapes that had once threatened survival now hosted routine activity. This transformation made personal experience feel increasingly abstract, as if it belonged to a different world. Survivors sometimes visited these places later. The visit rarely provided closure. Familiar landmarks looked smaller. Distances felt shorter. Danger felt absent. The contrast was unsettling. It suggested that the hardship had not been inherent to the place, but to the time and conditions under which it had been encountered. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought ambiguity. If the land was not inherently hostile, then survival had been shaped by timing and circumstance more than anything else. The frontier had not been conquered. It had simply changed. As survival stories aged, they became easier to summarize. People spoke in generalities. It was hard. It took time. We managed. These phrases contained truth, but little detail. They allowed conversation to move on, without reopening complexity. For some, this simplification felt like relief. The story no longer required maintenance. It could exist without explanation. For others, it felt like loss. The experience had been reduced to something that fit comfortably into a sentence. Time also altered identity. Survivors stopped thinking of themselves as survivors. They became farmers, workers, parents, neighbors. Survival receded into background context rather than defining feature. This shift was gradual and often unnoticed. The habits formed during survival remained, but their origins blurred. Conserving, preparing, avoiding waste, preferring predictability. These behaviors felt natural rather than reactive. Survival had rewritten defaults so thoroughly that they no longer felt like adaptations. Eventually, the frontier survival stories existed mostly outside the people who had lived them. They lived in records, summaries, and lessons. The lived experience became secondary. What mattered was what could be said about it, not what it had been like. This distance is often mistaken for forgetting. It is not. It is accommodation. Memory adjusts to allow life to proceed without constant reference to hardship. The mind does not erase survival. It files it in a way that no longer interrupts the present. In this way, time becomes the final condition of survival. Not danger, not endurance, but integration. The experience is neither celebrated nor avoided. It becomes part of a larger continuity, no longer demanding attention. In the next and final part, we will let even this perspective fade slightly and allow the series to rest where these stories ultimately belong, not in explanation and not in lesson, but in quiet acknowledgement. For now, you can rest. Time does not resolve survival. It simply makes room for it to exist without noise. By the time time itself has softened the edges, what remains of these survival stories is quiet acceptance, not understanding, not meaning, just acknowledgement that things were endured, and that endurance did not require explanation in order to count. The people who survived the American frontier did not carry a single lesson forward. They carried familiarity with discomfort, with uncertainty, with days that did not improve but still had to be lived. This familiarity did not make them wiser in a dramatic sense. It made them steadier, less surprised by difficulty, less dependent on reassurance. What fades last is not fear or pain, but pacing. Survivors moved through life at a different speed afterward. They rushed less, they waited more easily. They understood that some outcomes arrived only after long stretches of doing very little. This patience was not philosophical, it was learned. In the end, the frontier did not teach people how to win. It taught them how to continue when winning was irrelevant, when progress could not be measured, when effort did not guarantee improvement. Survival operated without feedback, and people adapted to that absence. This is why these stories resist summary. They do not fit into moral arcs. They do not reward interpretation. They exist as records of persistence under pressure that offered no promise of relief. That persistence was not dramatic. It was repetitive and quiet. When we listen to these stories now, especially in the softened versions passed down to us, it is easy to miss what made them truly brutal. Not danger alone, but duration. Not hardship alone, but the length of time it lasted without explanation. Survival was not tested once. It was tested daily, without variation. And yet, people continued, not because they believed they should, but because stopping offered no advantage. This is the most honest version of endurance, not motivated, not inspired, simply functional. There is no need to admire this too much. Admiration can distort. It can turn endurance into expectation. These stories are not instructions. They are reminders of what humans can tolerate when circumstances remove alternatives. So we let them rest here, not as myths, not as warnings, just as they were lived, long, uneven, quietly brutal, and ultimately unresolved. If this kind of slow, factual history helps you drift off, feel free to subscribe quietly. No urgency. The frontier will not notice either way. For now, you can rest. The story does not end. It simply becomes quiet enough to sleep beside. At the very end of these stories, there is no final image worth holding on to, no clear scene that explains everything, no moment where survival transforms into something else. What remains is ordinariness, life continuing at a manageable pace, shaped quietly by what came before. The American frontier did not leave people with answers. It left them with adjusted expectations. They learned that improvement was optional, but continuation was not. That comfort could disappear quickly, but routine could be rebuilt slowly. That endurance did not need encouragement to function. The most brutal survival stories are therefore not dramatic memories. They are background conditions. They exist in the way people approached work, rest, food, and uncertainty long after danger passed. They shaped decisions without announcing themselves. They influenced behavior without asking for recognition. When everything is stripped away, survival on the frontier looks less like heroism and more like tolerance. Tolerance for cold that lasted too long, for hunger that arrived repeatedly, for uncertainty that never clarified itself. People lived because they adapted to these conditions, not because they overcame them. This is not a satisfying ending, which is why it is rarely used. Stories prefer resolution. Survival prefers sustainability. The frontier did not offer meaning in exchange for suffering. It offered continuation, unevenly distributed and without explanation. Remembering these stories honestly does not require admiration. It requires restraint, allowing them to remain uncomfortable, unresolved, and quietly human. Allowing survival to be what it was, not what later narratives wanted it to be. So we leave it here, not with a conclusion, but with stillness, the kind that follows long endurance, the kind that does not demand attention, the kind that allows sleep. And if this slow, quietly brutal history helps you drift off, you already know what to do. A gentle subscribe, if you feel like it. No pressure. The frontier never cared either way. For now, you can rest. Nothing else needs to happen.